Hello. Shock and overwhelming sadness dominated British politics today after the sudden death of the Labour leader John Smith. Mr. Smith suffered a massive heart attack at his London home this morning. He died in hospital at 9:15. He was 55 years old. Mr. Smith's wife Elizabeth had been with him. Later, Mrs. Smith flew to the family's home in Edinburgh to be reunited with two of their daughters. A third daughter is in America. John Smith was with his wife at his last public appearance yesterday evening. He was looking fit and well as he arrived to attend a Labour Party fundraising dinner. In the House of Commons this afternoon, MPs paid tribute. John Major called him one of the outstanding parliamentarians of modern politics. Mr. Smith's deputy, Margaret Beckett, said his death has brought tears to the eyes of all who knew him. And earlier, Labour's chairman, David Blunkett, said, "I think he's given his life for the Labour Party." In this specially extended early evening news, we'll have tributes from across the political divide. We'll also look back on a remarkable life in politics. First, here's our chief political correspondent, Glyn Mathias.
To report to the House the death of the Right Honourable John Smith, QC, member for Monklands East. The House will wish to know that this sitting will now be suspended until 3:30, when the adjournment will be moved so that tributes may be paid to the Right Honourable Member.
And it was a packed House which reassembled to hear those tributes, listening in a hushed silence.
Gathered outside Westminster as the shock of John Smith's death sank in. Tributes were brought in and MPs could barely contain their grief. His closest friends, who'd spent a convivial evening with him just last night, were distraught.
Elected to the House together, we shared common views about the Labour Party.
Stressed MPs queued up from all political parties to pay their tributes to this most popular of men.
Smith, we go live now to our political editor, Michael Brunson. Mike, it's a sad day, but the reality is that politics goes on. What happens now?
Well, the party, first of all, has got to have a few days simply to come to terms with this. It is difficult to overestimate the shock which has gone through the party.
His flat in central London at 8:05 this morning. He was pronounced dead at St Bartholomew's Hospital nearby just an hour and 10 minutes later. His wife Elizabeth, as we reported, was with him throughout.
John Smith's London home, the Barbican, a few hundred yards from St Bartholomew's Hospital, where he was rushed after collapsing just after 8 o'clock this morning. Long before any official announcement, as journalists began to gather, it became obvious the news was serious. An eyewitness described what he saw.
I see an ambulance arrive at Bart's Hospital with loads of policemen, loads of paramedics. A man on a stretcher with obviously undressed with a, what do you call it, face mask on him. And they rushed him into the hospital.
John Smith was having a bath when he began to complain of chest pains. Moments later, he collapsed. His wife and police bodyguard immediately tried to resuscitate him, as did paramedics arriving from the hospital. But there was nothing which could be done. Professor of Medicine Mike Besser.
We believe he had a massive heart attack. An ambulance was called and arrived at 8:15. The ambulance arrived at St Bartholomew's Hospital at 8:40 a.m. Resuscitation attempts, which had commenced prior to arrival, were continued at Bart's. Despite full medical attention to Mr. Smith, he was pronounced dead at 9:15 on the 12th of May.
With official confirmation stunned disbelief. Many of the journalists here had spent last night with Mr. Smith at a dinner in the city. Shadow Minister Donald Dewar and his wife arrived. They're close friends of the Smith family, but were too distressed to speak.
Shock to his constituents in Monklands East in central Scotland. Mr. Smith had been their MP since 1983, returned at the last election with a comfortable 15,000 majority.
Flags have flown at half-mast all day in John Smith's Monklands constituency, where Labour Party members were proud that the opposition leader was their MP.
John Smith never forgot his political roots. They were forged during a childhood in the remote Highlands. He first stood for Parliament 3 decades ago when he was just 21. He failed to win then, but success soon followed.
John Smith was a family man from a small Scottish village whose resolute ambition carried him to the top of British political life. The son of a Presbyterian schoolmaster, his early life in a Highland village taught him respect, discipline and integrity. values which he carried with him on his journey from the Highlands to the Palace of Westminster. That journey had begun at Glasgow University, where he read law and history. He joined the bar before entering Parliament in 1970. Rising fast, he was one of the few members of today's Labour Party who could remember real political power. Callaghan had brought him into his cabinet. But in those early days, with a young family and wife to consider, he brushed aside suggestions that he would be Prime Minister.
I don't think anybody in their right mind would want to be a Prime Minister. I mean, the responsibilities are really quite awesome, not only for the state of the world, never mind the state of this particular country.
Opposition brought its own challenges for this serious and conscientious politician and orator. On the right wing of the party, he'd fought too many elections, watched 4 defeats, seen 4 humiliations. As Shadow Chancellor at the last election, he was in the front line campaigning. But after Kinnock conceded it was over, Smith put himself forward as leader. He sold himself as the man who could take the party to power, the natural successor, the safe pair of hands. Despite concerns about his health, his party gave him the job.
I therefore declare that John Smith is elected the leader of the Labour Party.
It was John Smith's chance to follow through Neil Kinnock's attempts to reform the party, and he wasted no time. His strategy was to take on the unions straight away. He did, battling for one member, one vote at last year's party conference. He won. It was a personal victory for him, historic for the party, the acid test of his leadership. He passed. His successor will be elected according to the rules he risked his own leadership to see introduced.
The Prime Minister certainly has his work cut out.
And at the dispatch box, John Smith could be formidable.
Much the same as Eddie the Eagle had.
He was always articulate, always fast, sometimes funny.
In attempting to win the gold at the Winter Olympics a few years ago.
And during the debate after the government's decision to leave the ERM, he was blistering about John Major.
He is the devalued Prime Minister of a devalued government.
The admirable qualities John Smith brought to his political life were nurtured in a strong and secure personal life.
We're a happy family and we want to have our privilege of our privacy, really. And of course, it's the one thing you lose in politics. Although living in Edinburgh has made it easier. When I was ill, they all came round me, and that helped me a great deal. And I also know there are more important things in life than politics, and that's a fundamentally important thing for a politician to know.
To his final resting place on the windswept Hebridean island of Iona. He'll be buried there in a private family ceremony tomorrow. Today, at the church where he worshipped near his home in Edinburgh, there was a simple public funeral where his friends spoke of the man whose achievements, in the words of one, filled the nation with a sense of the cruelty and injustice of death. From Edinburgh, our political editor Robin Oakley reports.
The death of Labour's leader, as his eulogist said, put politics into perspective. It also brought Westminster to the red sandstone Cluny Parish Church John Smith, a Christian socialist, had attended most Sundays over the past decade, for what was virtually a state funeral. The shadow cabinet, some of whom will soon be vying for the succession, were there. So were MPs of all faiths and parties, and Labour's former leaders. But it was John Smith's family, his wife Elizabeth and daughters Sarah, Jane and Catherine, who were in everybody's thoughts, as the best man at the Smiths' wedding helped to bring laughter as well as tears to the mourning.
Without Elizabeth, and later the 3 girls, John simply could not have achieved what he did. The Smith women, mind you, are a formidable team. And I once remarked to him when he was Shadow Chancellor that it might provide useful evidence of his potential ability to control spending departments. With a wry grunt, he pointed out that that might not be the case if people realised just how unsuccessful he had been.
Many were grieving for a great parliamentarian they'd expected to be the next Prime Minister, and the 900-strong congregation included European socialist leaders.
Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth.
The singing in Gaelic of the 23rd Psalm underlined John Smith's essential Scottishness, the sense of community he'd acquired as schoolmaster's son in an Argyll fishing village. Some 2,000 people had gathered outside the church to pay their respects to a man always anxious to speak up for those who couldn't speak up for themselves.
His generosity in word and in deed, his caring for individuals, his loyalty and his patriotism, his high honour as a man.
One of 3 old friends from Glasgow University speaking insisted John Smith wasn't always the sober sides depicted by some media.
He could start a party in an empty room, and often did.
He stressed how widely Labour's lost leader would be missed.
What has been striking over the last dark week has not been the tributes of the great and the good, handsome though they have been. It has been the sadness, the dismay, the sense of loss across the whole range of our community. That's what matters, and that's what would have mattered and touched John. The people know they have lost a friend, someone who was on their side. They know it, and they feel it.
Lord Callaghan was representing the Queen. The service had succeeded in bringing together the essential strands of John Smith's life. Tomorrow, as Labour faces a more uncertain future without him, Mr. Smith will be buried on the island of Iona, cradle of Scottish Christianity, where ancient Scottish kings were interred. The friends and opponents who mourned him today will remember a man who helped to destroy the notion that politics is a dishonest game. And they'll recall Margaret Beckett's request that his epitaph should be the last words he uttered in public. The opportunity to serve our country, that is all we ask. Robin Oakley, BBC News.
There were to be no crowds, no cameras, and no television satellite trucks. The single photographer there captured the quiet, unfussed ceremony as John Smith's family and closest friends gathered outside the small stone chapel to see him to his final resting place. Iona off the west coast is considered the cradle of Christianity in Scotland. It was also an island loved by John Smith. The 12th century chapel, its cemetery long known as the Graveyard of Kings, is the oldest building on the island. Here the crowds from yesterday's high-profile Edinburgh funeral were gone. Just a few islanders, bareheaded to show their respect, joined wife, daughters and friends at the graveside.